Let me adjust this. Excellent. Okay, thank you so much for coming. Here we have Dr. Rebecca Comay. I'll go ahead and introduce her, and then she's asked us also to introduce ourselves briefly as we get started. So Dr. Rebecca Comay, can you hear me okay?
I hear you well, yeah.
Great. She joins us today from the University of Toronto, where she's a professor of philosophy and comparative literature, and she's also the director of the program in literary studies. She's also previously taught in the Jewish Studies Department's art program and the German program. Her book, Morning Sickness, Hegel and the French Revolution, came out from Stanford UP in 2011. She's also edited the collections Lost in the Archives and Ending Questions in Memory in Hegel and Heidegger. And her primary research interests include 19th and 20th century continental philosophy, and more specifically Hegel and post-Hegelian philosophy, Marx and Marxism, Benjamin and Adorno, and contemporary French philosophy. But one of her recent articles, Hegel's Last Words, Mourning and Melancholia at the End of Phenomenology, from a collection called Ends of History, it marks her continuing interest in psychoanalytic thought and the works of Freud, which we see again today in this upcoming piece. And she also has interest, and she works on historical trauma and memory, including work on the commemoration and post-Holocaust representation. And she's also interested in literary and aesthetic theory, iconoclasm, the destruction of art, and contemporary art, architecture, as well as proofs. There's just a very brief introduction. Yeah, and then would you mind starting if we go around to introduce ourselves?
Hello, I'm Simon Sadler. I feel like I'm gate crashing this actually. I am in the design department where I teach history and theory, and but I'm happy to hear about the reference to art and architecture at the end of that introduction. So if I just quickly explain why I'm here, I'll be here briefly unfortunately because I've got to go somewhere else, but so in my own work I'm kind of interested in how designers think and how they imagine that their work can be an act of resistance, because it's actually a pretty core concept, strangely enough, in design and architecture, that one is in some way resisting. But I always wonder, resisting what and how. So.
My name is Tamar Kanay-Shalit. I'm a graduate student in anthropology. I'm just writing up my dissertation, about to graduate in about a month and a half, so a lot of time crunch. But I'm really happy to be here. I'm writing on Israeli personhood and the way that it's produced in the process of life coaching training in Israel, because life coaching is very, very popular in Israel. Actually, Israel has the highest number of trained coaches per capita in the world.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's quite popular. And right now I'm really struggling with the idea of resistance, because I found that personhood is produced through resistance in the process of life coaching training. So I'm sort of struggling with this idea of sort of resistance. I'm really happy to be here and think this through. So resistance in therapy or in life coaching in my case, and personhood. These are the sort of topics that are in my head right now. Yeah.
Okay, hi, my name is Chow. I'm a grad student in the Agricultural Resource Economics department. So I'm a bit out of place here. But I'm doing my dissertation research in China, which is it's a place I actually never spent much time there myself. So so there's a lot of there's a big cultural difference, and in economics we don't really deal with we just deal with numbers mostly. So I started coming to I feel I should expose myself to more something outside my field, and so hopefully I'll learn something new today.
Sorry, I didn't catch your name.
Chow Su.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, and I'm Tikla Babiak. I recently got my PhD in musicology from Cornell, and I'm working on some of the links between Beethoven and Hegel. So this is very, very relevant to my work, and especially looking at ideas of dialectic and reflection and time in both Beethoven and Hegel. And I am hoping to bring Freud into the dialogue a little bit in my own work.
My name is Val Recker, and I'm actually a postdoc here at UC Davis, but my background is in literature, transatlantic modernist literatures, and I was really interested in ideas of temporality and repetition. And when I was reading your article, a few questions popped up in my mind about Gertrude Stein, which is a little off topic, but maybe we'd have time to get to those. And also Benjamin, you mentioned him briefly, and Deleuze. And I was thinking about the kind of the temporal map of the article, or how you map temporality in certain moments. I was really interested, looking forward to discussing that.
Okay, great. Well, nice to meet you all. How would you like to proceed? I suggested to Laurel rather than just speaking at you from my computer, I suggested circulating the essay first of all, so that we could maybe discuss any points that you wanted to bring up. I'm not sure if you've all had a chance to look at it, or if that would be the most productive way of proceeding. I hadn't planned on giving a lecture here. So I need a little bit of guidance from you as to what would be the best way of going. So this isn't a test question. Have you read it?
And of course, everybody has a copy here. Yeah, and we've been discussing actually what we were about to call you. And I think we might have questions kind of from all over the place. I certainly had some prepared, but I was wondering, could you make just a few introductory remarks? Maybe just to kind of orient us, since we come from so many diverse backgrounds.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I thought. I mean, I should say my first, this is kind of all spillover from my, well, now not so recent actually, I still call it my recent book, Morning Sickness, which is a book on Hegel, which very much draws on psychoanalysis, and thinking of Hegel instead of the normal way, which is the kind of notorious Hegel as the philosopher of onward and upward, inexorable progress. I started thinking of him actually as a theorist of historical trauma, whose closest affinity was Freud. And the event that Hegel's thought, the historical event that really Hegel's thought pivots around, is the French Revolution, specifically the French Revolutionary Terror, about which Hegel was kind of unique among his contemporaries, that is to say his German intellectual, liberal, professorial contemporaries, in not seeing the terror as just this kind of unfortunate byproduct of the revolution and something that could be, swept to the side in order to recapture the good emancipatory, liberal, progressive thrust of the revolution. Hegel really thought that terror was an essential moment of the revolution, and thought very hard about it, just what that implicated. So anyway, without going too much into that, one of the residual things that working on that project, residual questions that working on that project left me with was this nagging feeling like, how on earth do you think about, great, large-scale historical events, and with psychoanalysis in hand, which was conceived of as a clinical practice, and conceived of as a theory stemming out of that about, which largely deals with individuals in their interrelations, and Freud's own phrase into what he called sometimes group psychology, and applied psychoanalysis were not necessarily the most successful parts of his project, I believe. So what I've been thinking about now, a few years later, is motivated by some issues that have arisen in parallel fashion, reading both Freud on the one hand and Hegel on the other hand. And with respect to Freud, I didn't necessarily set out to produce a kind of taxonomy or inventory of all the ways in which resistance reared its head in a clinical concept, which is where it most richly gets elaborated. But it became a little bit of a game once I started doing that. How we're used to thinking of Freud, Freud's most notorious statement that that a no, the negative operator no is always an implicit affirmation, culminating in the famous "it's not my mother" frame, which becomes the surest indicator to the analyst that, aha, you're talking about your mother right? That the no is a kind of way of slipping in content that couldn't otherwise be acknowledged. And I, like so many people, started, came assuming that resistance was basically a form of negativity in that sense. But what surprised me, reading Freud, reading all the case histories all over again, was how resistant. It's not so much that every no is a secret yes. That is to say, every denial or protestation or refusal on the part of the analysand can be categorized as resistance, and therefore a proof of a deeper investment in what is being denied. But equally, affirmation itself can be, the places which seem the least resistant can be the most resistant. So I became very intrigued by all these modalities of negative acquiescence, we could call it, whereby the absence of tangible resistance can itself be the most potent form of resistance, and nodding, agreeing, politely affirming, acquiescing, fetishistically acknowledging something by way of fetishistic disavowal, saying yes, I know, but as a way of basically being able to continue on in one's own beliefs unimpeded. Not to mention something which, just all the ways of knowingness and theoretical compliance, and in which one collaborates with the analyst and becomes their peer, their ally, or their interlocutor. All ways of kind of buying time. So the inventory itself began to intrigue me. But you mentioned Laurel. Is it Lauren or Laurel? I'm sorry, it's
With
Laurel.
an L, yeah.
Sorry, yeah, an L, 2 L's. But the issue of temporality, and that's one of the things that really became quite preoccupying to me, because one tends to think of resistance using the physical model, the model from physics, as being all about delay and drag, sort of something that's holding you back, and there's this fundamental impediment to making progress. The words aren't coming, or the associations aren't coming, or nothing's happening, and there's this kind of stagnation. The Wolfman being the kind of, I guess, the most exemplary case of this kind of delay, this nothing's happening, sort of 18 months are going on, and nothing is moving. So one tends to associate resistance with this kind of this physical, almost physical-like impediment. Something's holding you back. But what became equally clear is that speed can be, and this relates to these comments on affirmation I guess I was making, that haste can be the biggest form of resistance. Like let's just skitter over all the difficulties and just get there as quickly as we can. And this seems to be the flip side of delay, this kind of precipitous, exaggerated impatience, which Freud eventually theorizes as being a kind of wild analysis, maybe just kind of getting the truth of analysis as a theoretical doctrine that can somehow be absorbed or acknowledged without actually going through all the really terrible and anguishing delays that are connected with the process itself. I'm intrigued by hearing maybe we can hear more about life coaching in this regard, because the relationship between I'm saying this because the relationship between psychoanalysis, the real thing, the 4 times a week, 5 times a week, 7-year, 10-year, Woody Allen, 30-year kind of long process, and shorter, more short-term and shorter approaches to whatever it is that brings people into analysis. Is, of course, one of the great theoretical and technical issues. So there's a question of time is of huge interest here, and that's one of the things that I thought we could talk about vis-a-vis resistance. So that's one of the sets of issues that was informing my thought and is informing that middle and main section of the paper, which is on Freud. With respect to Hegel, and this is kind of comes on the heels of the work I was doing, linking Hegel with contemporary trauma theory and specifically psychoanalysis. had to do with something on the one hand fairly similar, that Hegel is reviled so frequently in the very same terms that Freud is reviled. Every no means a yes. Every protest is proof of the cogency and vitality of the interpretation. Hegel's who explicitly talks about the explicitly and repeatedly talks about the irresistible force of the idea, how every resistance becomes an opportunity, becomes not only a trigger for overcoming that resistance, but becomes the essential opportunity and requirement for thinking to proceed. So the point being, without that resistance, nothing could happen. But for basic reasons that you can't have an insight. I mean, you can't have a speculative, philosophical, Hegelian insight without having earned it. So you can't. One of Hegel's many formulas in the preface and phenomenology is, truth is not a freshly minted coin. It's not something you can just have or beginning. You've got to, fight for it. So the resistance to insight is the very measure of the value of that insight. But what really strikes me every time I read the phenomenology and look at Hegel, despite and because of the absolute insistence on what he calls the necessary progress, of the idea, which gets theorized in all sorts of ways, is how incredibly inefficient the process actually is. If you read the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel's big book, it's really the story of one learning disaster after another. I mean, consciousness keeps on learning its lesson, keeps on forgetting its lesson, keeps on making the same errors in more tenacious form, more sophisticated form. And the thing perhaps we're going to get to this issue of repetition, Laura, that you brought up, but the thing just keeps on spiraling around itself in this extraordinarily inefficient manner, as if there's this congenital or constitutional inability to simply move on with a given insight or truth. And so that really intrigued me, that sort of the consistent delay which marks it has narrative issues, it has philosophical issues, it has deep psychological issues, but that continues to strike me. And again, the flip side of that delay, just as for Freud, has to do with this overwhelming haste, this desire to. One of the things that keeps on getting in the way is that I'm speaking still about the Phenomenology, Hegel's greatest book, in my opinion, is how impatient consciousness constantly is to get there. It's so eager to grab at the result that this becomes one of its biggest impediments. So those were a few of the things that were informing both the Freud section on the one hand and the Hegel section on the other hand. And so, I mean, maybe you guys want to take it up from here, or of course the political ramifications of all this is the third and chronologically first section in the paper. But perhaps we can also get to that.
Yeah. Does anyone have a question? Or?
I need to formulate something.
Well, I had an initial question, actually, about the repetition. And I was curious about the relationship between the repetition and the idea of resistance. Because your paper goes to great lengths, and it very nicely explains the idea of resistance being very complex and dialectical, etc. But repetition, I thought in your essay, is presented more as one of those forms of negativity. It's a sense of stuckness, I believe, a sense of language is tricky. It seems to be presented as inhibiting, and you referenced stuckness several times, but I was wondering what would the relationship between repetition and resistance be exactly for you, and does the idea of repetition maybe have a more generative or creative quality as resistance does. So do you view them kind of similarly in that regard, or is resistance unique, distinct from resistance in that way? I'm having a little trouble articulating my question.
I think I understand what you're. Let me just see if I understand the question. I have the resistance that I was tracking throughout and down to its etymology was a dialectically double-edged thing, which was as much about stuckness as about energy, as about this kind of impetus forward, and so on. And I think you're asking whether repetition is just on the side of on the side of stuckness
and stagnancy. Right? I found them.
And so on, or whether there can be in a perhaps Kierkegaardian sense a repetition forward, such that repetition becomes the not simply an impediment to movement, becomes the very motor.
Right, and to build on that, I also just there were two quotes where you mentioned repetition that I had questions about. On page 16, you had said, "But if you try to introduce repetition as the mother of all resistances, that is, as the unifying principle or genus of resistance, the very principle of resistance breaks down, and the logic of repetition ruins conceptuality." And I was a little bit confused there, which may be where my question comes from on exactly what that might mean. If there can be no coherent concept of repetition, it follows that there can be no unified concept of resistance. And personally, I was just struggling to come up with to understand that dynamic between repetition and resistance, to pin it down.
So in the section that you're pointing to, I'm working with Derrida at this point.
Yeah.
Who's, who in his wonderful essay, do you know it, the essay Resistance is, which is kind of really this teasing out of the psychoanalytic category of resistance. Derrida, while exploring the many different, Freud at one point classifies resistance. He kind of says there's 5 different kinds of resistance, and they all belong, 3 in this category, 2 in this category, and so on. And some belonging to the ego, some belonging to the id, so-called, and some, but basically they all belong to the superegos. I mean, eventually it all comes down to, this masochism, sadism of